Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on managing Teams governance and security. I'm Jason Lee, I'm the collaboration and content lead at Chorus. We're a Microsoft Gold partner in the UK. So the plan for today's session, we're going to take a quick look at Teams architecture, how everything hangs together. We'll look at typical concerns, so the typical things we hear when we're talking to you. We'll look at some tools and controls that you can use to address, to mitigate some of those concerns, and then we'll finish with some Q&A. So slides should run for about 30 minutes. Add your questions as you go along. Hopefully you can all see the Q&A panel. I won't be able to see your questions until the end of the slide deck just because of the way we're set up, but we'll look to get through as many of those as we can at the end. Okay, so let's take a look at Teams, how everything works, how it all hangs together. So this is Microsoft's vision for Teams. They want it to be the one place you go for teamwork. So a single UI where you've got your chat, your meetings, your calls, your collaboration, your files, everything you need to work together. And it's accessible anywhere you've got an internet connection, over the web, through a desktop app, through a mobile app. So that's as far as I'm going with the marketing. Let's look at the component parts. So Teams, there's very little to Teams in itself. It builds on several other Microsoft 365 platforms and applications. And you'll see as we go through that the way you manage Teams is by understanding and managing and applying governance to these underlying platforms. So the most notable of these platforms, we've got SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, Exchange, and Microsoft 365 groups. So any files that you add to a team in Teams are stored in SharePoint. Any files you post in Teams channels as part of a conversation are also stored in SharePoint. Any files that you send in direct messages to one or more people in Teams are stored in your OneDrive. Channel posts and direct messages themselves are copied to Exchange Online. Technically speaking, they're actually stored in Azure Cosmos DB, but for compliance reasons, so that you've got the ability to manage them, they're copied to mailboxes. So channel posts go into the group mailbox for a team, and direct messages are stored in individual mailboxes. Incidentally, channel posts within private channels are handled slightly differently. They are copied to the individual mailboxes of everyone who has access to that private channel. And then finally, Microsoft 365 groups underpins almost everything that Teams is about, most notably team membership, but we'll be looking at that in a lot more detail shortly. So it's worth just briefly making it clear that not everything you do in Teams is scoped to a specific team. So outside of a team, you can basically do everything that you used to be able to do in Skype for Business. You can make and receive audio and video calls, you can hold meetings, and you can use direct messaging. So there's pretty much feature parity with Skype for Business in what you can do outside of a team. Within a specific team, you've got some more abilities. You've got the ability to manage files, to use channel scoped persistent chats, you can have channel scope meetings, and you can add apps. So our focus from a governance point of view is going to be on this, what you can do within specific teams, because that's where most concerns that we hear lie. So Microsoft 365 groups are central to how Teams works. Microsoft 365 groups were called Office 365 groups until a week or two ago. So you'll still see both names out there in lots of places. Most of you probably know this already, but a Microsoft 365 group is a type of security group in Azure Active Directory. Like any security group, it's got a list of members, but it's also got a set of associated services. These groups aren't new at all. So you'll notice that Microsoft 365 groups get created when users do various things. So anytime a user creates a new modern team site in SharePoint, or a new group in Outlook, a new plan in Planner, various other things, every time that happens, a Microsoft 365 group gets created. So you may have far more of these than you expect. When that happens, the person who triggered the group creation is the group owner, and the group membership is then granted access to all of the connected services. So everything works through this Microsoft 365 group when you create a team in Teams. So the membership of your team is the membership of the underlying Microsoft 365 group. That membership is then automatically granted access to the SharePoint site, to the group mailbox, to Stream if you're storing meeting recordings, to Planner, to anything else that you add to this Microsoft 365 group. And if you drill into that in a bit more detail, it's reasonably elegant the way it works under the surface. So taking SharePoint as one example, you see everyone you add to your team gets added to the membership of the Microsoft 365 group. So all your team is a wrapper, lightweight wrapper around this Office 365 group. That team membership is then dropped right into the members group of the SharePoint Online site. So what this means is that anyone that you add to your team automatically has contribute rights on files in the team, which are managed in this underlying SharePoint site. So these kind of integrations, you'll see why they're important when we come to look at governance. So typical concerns that we hear. Proliferation is a big one. So a lot of administrators, service owners are worried at the number of teams and Microsoft 365 groups increasing very rapidly. People worry about duplication, people creating teams to solve the same problem independently, so you end up with more than one team for the same underlying requirement. Uncontrolled information sharing, so basically you don't have central control. Are people managing files, sensitive information in an appropriate way? No insight or no default access for administrators. And then best practice around team size and that kind of thing. So the last one, best practices around sizing teams, that's huge. So that could be a webinar in itself. So I'll stick to my governance and security brief for today. And then if there's sufficient demand, we could look at some of those best practices another time. So instinctive responses to some of those concerns. People want to lock things down, they want to take central control, they want to build in approval processes, basically manage how and when teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites are created. The trouble with this approach is if you make it too difficult for users to get up and running, they tend to go elsewhere. So if users can't quickly create a team to meet their collaboration requirement, they can use Slack, they'll use Trello for task management, they'll use Box or Dropbox for file management, and so on. And once your content is in those kind of third-party services, you lose all ability to govern it. So attempting to manage it centrally is usually unsustainable. It's also not particularly effective. So your central IT team isn't really in the right place to try and predict collaboration requirements or dictate working practices to the organization. So the trade-off is this. Any of you that have been to our events in various places will know this is one of my favorite slides. There's always a trade-off. If you give up some control over how and when users create these spaces, you've got the benefit that at least you're keeping them within an environment where you have the ability to apply some governance controls to basically put a perimeter, a framework in place for users to work within. So this is the better way. You allow users to get on your new teams. You provide guidance and training. Microsoft have a whole bunch of guidance and training you can leverage, and you provide a framework of tools and controls that your users can operate within. And this is really what governance is. It's not micromanagement. It's putting a framework in place, putting controls that don't require you to micromanage every single team. So let's start looking at some of those broad areas of concern and how we might be able to recommend some tools and techniques that can help. So some of the tools we're going to talk about do span multiple areas, so do expect some overlap there. So first of all, managing team and group proliferation. So the key to this is really effective lifecycle management. Most of the information you create, most teams and groups and SharePoint sites should have a finite lifetime. I think we're all hopefully moving away from the idea that every piece of information you create, you keep forever. So you manage proliferation by managing dormancy, by looking at that information that's no longer used, no longer required, and cleaning it up. So at the most basic level, you've got user-centric archiving. So owners of teams can go into the team settings, they can archive the team. What that does, it hides the team from the UI. It freezes activities so no one can post in channels, continue conversations, and you've got the option here, you can see as well, to make the SharePoint site read-only. So this is great for removing clutter from the team's UI, but it doesn't actually delete the team, the underlying group, or its content. So if you are worried about retaining information for longer than you should, so beyond its intended life cycle, then we need to look at some other options. And a good way of doing that is to look at group expiration policies. You remember I said at the start we manage teams by managing the underlying services. So this is a good example of that. You'll see a lot of these controls are actually controls on the underlying Microsoft 365 group rather than the team itself. So as administrators, as service owners, you can specify a default lifetime for Microsoft 365 groups. And what happens is when the end of that default lifetime is approaching, the owners will start getting notifications. They'll start getting emails asking them to renew their team. If they don't renew the team, it gets deleted. You've then got 30 days to recover that team if it was deleted in error. So there are some protections built into this to hopefully stop this policy from deleting teams and groups that it shouldn't. So the first one is that if the group is active, if the team is active, it will be automatically renewed. It won't get deleted. And that activity can be absolutely anything. If someone views a file on the underlying SharePoint site, someone views a channel post, that all counts as activity and that will stop that group from being archived. So it's only dormant groups that are deleted if they're not actively renewed. You'll notice here as well, you do have to provide an email contact for groups with no owners. So this means that if your group is what we call an orphaned group, so the person who set it up has left the business, but the team members are carrying on using it, you've got this fallback as well, that you can specify email address of an admin or a group that will receive this notification and can look into it and make sure that someone else takes ownership of that team. This is one of those things that requires Azure AD Premium P1 licensing. So a lot of these controls do require that P1 license in Azure AD. The other way of managing proliferation is through user education. So ideally, we want to be educating our users on when they should be creating new teams, when they should be creating new channels instead, when they should be creating private channels, which are a bit of a minefield. Searching before you create a team to see whether a team already exists is one of the top tips. It's not always useful though, because you will typically only see results if your teams are public. You can also look at extending existing Microsoft 365 groups with Teams. So if, for example, you've already got a Microsoft 365 group for a finance department, if they're using a SharePoint team site or an Outlook group, you can add a team on top of that existing group rather than creating a brand new team, which will create a new Microsoft 365 group in the background. So all of these things require a bit of user education. What you can do is make the ability to create new teams contingent on training, and you do that by restricting the ability to create Microsoft 365 groups to members of a specific security group. So basically, when people have completed their training, you drop them into that security group. They've then got the ability to go ahead and create teams whenever they want. Again, that last one is one of those features that requires a P1 license in Azure AD. Okay, so our next area of concern, managing team and group duplication. So there's quite a lot of overlap there. Again, the training user education points we mentioned should help a lot with that. If people are creating teams for the right reasons, using channels appropriately rather than creating new teams every time, that will help a lot. Encourage people to use public organization-wide teams where appropriate, because it makes the team, the group, easier to discover. So if there's no good reason why anyone in the organization shouldn't be able to join your team, then make it public. It just makes it more visible, makes it easier to find, means you're less likely to get duplication. You can leverage dynamic membership to ensure people belong to the right groups, which we'll take a closer look at in a second. You can leverage naming policies to improve clarity. And finally, managing dormancy helps with duplication as well. So let's look at dynamic membership. So this is, again, it's one of those functional areas that works on the underlying Microsoft 365 group rather than the team. So you can create a Microsoft 365 group where the membership of that group is determined by certain rules, and those rules are based on Active Directory attributes of your users. So if, for example, you wanted to automatically enroll anyone who's in the finance department in a finance group and team, you can do that kind of thing. You have to do this in a particular order. Create the group first. You have to create a new Microsoft 365 group with a specific membership type, which is dynamic user. That needs to be done through the admin center. So it's a job for you guys, job for the IT team. You define your membership rules. Once you're done, you can then create a team on top of that Microsoft 365 group. Those membership rules will then apply to the team. So people will find themselves automatically added to your finance team because you've set up the underlying Microsoft 365 group to do that. So this is what it looks like in Azure AD. It's reasonably straightforward to do. You've got a nice UI to build the rules. In this case, we're saying if your department is finance or if your job title contains the word accountant, we're going to add you to our group. And you can see that when we add a team to this group, if you look at the membership down here at the bottom, you'll see a banner here. This is telling us we can't add or remove members directly in the team because the membership is managed automatically. Again, should mention this is one of those areas that needs an Active Directory Azure AD Premium P1 license. The other policy area that might be useful for managing duplication is naming policies. So these policies can help manage duplication by making it clearer what existing teams are about. So you've got two approaches. You've got blocked words and you've got prefixes and suffixes. So the blocked words approach is useful if you're planning to create official teams for each of your departments. So, for example, if you plan to create a finance team, an IT team, a business development team, you can make those team names blocked words to stop other users creating teams with those names. Prefixes and suffixes can make users and admins clearer on what the team's about as well. So you set this up by basically choosing which Active Directory attributes of the team creator you want to add to the team name. So if, for example, you're a large multinational, you've got several subsidiaries, you might set up something like this on the right, where any team that gets created gets prefixed with the company name and the department name. So if, for example, someone in your UK finance team creates a team called accounts, the final name of that team would be UK finance accounts. I'd also like to offer a quick perspective on managing duplication. It's actually one of those things that people worry about, but it typically resolves itself. So what happens when lots of people create a team for the same reason? People will tend to coalesce around one of those duplicate groups or teams. So if, for example, you've got a business development team, a sales team, a business development content team, and they're all doing pretty much the same thing, what will happen over months is one of those teams will become heavily used, the others will fall dormant. So you can manage duplication to a large degree by managing dormancy. So that's going back to those expiration policies. Okay, so the next area is how do we manage how people share information? How do we ensure that sensitive information is treated in an appropriate way, or information is treated appropriately based on its sensitivity? So there's a few things to look at here. First is how we manage our guest users, so those users that are outside your organizations that you invite into teams. The second is classifications and labels, so how we set up a classification scheme to make our teams easier to govern. And the third area is some of the information protection controls that are available to us. So you can manage guest users in several places. So as your AD, you've got controls on how guest users access any resources within your company. You've got the same control Microsoft 365 tenancy wide, the same control for Microsoft 365 groups, same controls at the tenant level for Teams admin, and then you've got team specific controls as well. So I think the problem with these controls is they're either too broad, so you're enabling or disabling guest access for every single team in one fell swoop, or they're too specific. You're changing settings on a team by team basis, which is going to be pretty onerous if you're trying to manage this from a central team. So to find a middle ground, you need a classification scheme, and this is where classification with sensitivity labels comes in. So sensitivity labels are also called unified labels because the same labels are used across Azure Information Protection and Microsoft 365 now. They've been around for a while for protecting files, but it's only recently we've gained the ability to use these labels to classify Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and SharePoint sites. And the advantage of using sensitivity labels for classification rather than the older classification labels is that sensitivity labels actually give us some teeth, so you can apply controls based on the labels that people apply to teams and sites. So 3 steps to rolling this out. The first is you need to devise a set of categories for sensitivity. So you can see I've got 4 examples here. We've got non-business, general, confidential, highly confidential. and you'll probably want to put out a policy statement to help users to understand when they should use each of these labels, but hopefully it's reasonably straightforward, reasonably easily understood. We should also say that these labels, these categories, should really come from the whole business rather than just from the IT team. So we define our categories and we create a label in the Compliance Center in Microsoft 365 for each of our categories. For each of those labels we create, we're then going to determine which controls we want to apply to our teams when they have that label. So in this case over here, you can see that when this label is applied, we're saying the team must be private. We're not allowing the team owners, the underlying group owners, to add guest users, people from outside the organization. And we've also got the option here to lock it down to managed devices as well. So if you want to ensure that people only access content from a domain join machine or a machine that's enrolled with Intune, you can do that as well. Finally, step 3 is you publish the labels. So you publish the labels to the users who you want to be able to apply these labels. So this is where a degree of caution is appropriate. Start by publishing the labels to yourself or just to a small test team. Pilot it on a small scale. Make sure there's no resistance before you broaden it out to the rest of the organization. When you use these labels, you can see that users select the sensitivity label when they create the team. And you can see then that constraints are applied based on which label they choose. So here you can see our user has chosen highly confidential. They've only got the option to create a private group. And you can see here that if they were to go into the SharePoint site or try and add a guest user from Teams, they would be blocked from doing so. So those constraints are automatically applied. You can probably see the advantages to this. You're applying controls automatically based on what are hopefully easily understood classifications. So it's that happy medium, really. It's more nuanced than turning things on or off at the tenancy level, but it's got far less overhead than you guys having to try and manage individual teams one at a time. It does also give you some insight into how Teams is being used. It's not perfect. There are still some disadvantages. It's still young technology. So at the moment, there are still limitations. There aren't any ways of forcing users to choose a classification at the moment. We expect that to come later. Having said that, as administrators, you can easily run reports to see which teams aren't classified and chase them up if you need to. It also doesn't at the moment give us a mechanism for locking down external sharing of individual files. So it stops us adding guest users to the group, but you still need to apply other information protection controls if you want to make sure that users aren't sharing individual files. So last bit of this section is information protection. So I'm going to cover this fairly rapidly. Apologies if you can hear my toddler yelling in the background. So joy of working from home. How you protect your information, how you manage your information. You remember I said at the start, your data isn't actually stored in Teams. Teams in itself actually stores very, very little. All of your data is stored in underlying services. It's in SharePoint, it's in Exchange, it's in OneDrive. All of the protections that you can apply to those locations also apply to Teams users. So if you're applying protections to SharePoint, you're also applying protections to files that people manage within Teams because they are stored in SharePoint. So the kind of protections you can apply, we've got retention and expiration labels. We've got data loss prevention policies, and we've got item level sensitivity labels. Now I know we're quite pushed for time, so I'm going to fly through these. Retention labels basically control how long you want to keep files. This is either how long you want to make sure they're not deleted, or when you want to make sure they are deleted. So if, for example, you're obliged to delete files after 3 years after a certain event, you can do that. Data loss prevention policies are designed to help prevent accidental, inadvertent disclosure of sensitive information. So this allows you to pop up policy tips, warnings, or block when users are trying to send an email that contains sensitive information, or share a file from SharePoint or Teams that contains sensitive information. And you've got a whole bunch of control over how that happens, conditions, exceptions, actions. Again, apologies for rushing through this, but I want to make sure we leave time for your questions. I will, however, pause briefly on the best practices here. This is one of those areas that you can't really just switch on and forget about, as it has the potential to annoy people. You may find when you first roll out a policy, you get false positives, or there are legitimate reasons to share files that you might have missed when you switch this on. So roll it out gradually, use test mode, use policy tips only before you actually apply things that physically prevent people from sharing information. And you need to monitor it and tune it over time, make sure it's doing what you intended. Item level sensitivity labels. This is basically how you apply rights management to files. So if you want to make sure that your files are still protected, if people download them, forward them, this is how you do it. So this is functionality that came over from Azure Information Protection. Anyone who's got an E3 license has the ability to use these for Office file formats. You can apply encryption, you can apply rights management that prevents files from being printed, forwarded, and so on, and content marking as well if you want to add headers and footers. So last section, gaining insight into what people are doing with Teams, how people are using it. So let's start here by thinking about what are the legitimate questions to ask? What do you really need to know in terms of what your users are doing on Teams? So feel free to post anything I've missed here as a question. How are we controlling access for guest users? That's obviously a very legitimate question. How are we making sure that sensitive information is managed properly? How much data are we using? What's our adoption looking like across different areas of the business? And how are we ensuring that we keep our information for the right length of time? So hopefully you'll notice we've answered most of those questions already. So our label-based classifications have the side effect of giving us insight into intended use. Our naming policies also give us insight. Our DLP policies, incident reports to admins, are a great way of highlighting compliance issues. Can also be used to flag where people might have classified teams inappropriately. So if for example, you've got a team classified as general, but your DLP incident reports are saying they're sharing highly confidential files from that team, then you know you need to take a closer look. The labels you use for retention and expiration are also a good way of enhancing information discovery. Beyond that, you've got some very powerful tools when you do need to find specific content relating to a particular topic or individual. So this is typically when you've got a legal investigation going on. I think that's probably one example of legitimate use. This is the content search e-discovery tool in Microsoft 365. So this is a way of searching across all of your Microsoft 365 services. I think Planner is probably the notable exception at the moment. Planner doesn't have great support for compliance tools, but certainly across, you can see here across Exchange, Microsoft 365 Groups, Skype for Business, Teams messages, To-Do, Sway, Forms. You've got pretty good coverage of how you apply these tools. You can also apply very granular conditions and filtering and targeting to really find the information you're looking for. So I think most of the time the broader governance controls are hopefully the right happy medium between sort of managing things at a very broad brush tenancy level and breathing down individual users' necks. But when you do need to get really detailed information on sort of ongoing investigations, then you do have the tools to do that as well. Okay, so at this point, I will hand over to questions.